It was an ordinary morning, or at least it seemed like it should be. The sun shone brightly through the windows of the large, well-kept house. Inside, the commissioner's wife, Laura, was finishing her breakfast, enjoying the peaceful silence. She had the house to herself today, as her husband, the commissioner, was busy at work. It was one of those rare moments when she could unwind and enjoy the quiet. But then there was a knock at the door. Not just a gentle tap. This was more forceful, insistent. Laura, surprised by the sudden interruption, stood up from the table, wiping her hands on her apron. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, she found a group of police officers standing on her doorstep, their faces serious. "Good morning, ma'am," one of the officers said, his voice almost too stern. "We need to speak with you." Laura was confused. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked politely, trying to hide the unease creeping up her spine. "We need to conduct a search," the officer replied quickly, his words sounding rehearsed. "We have orders to search your home. It's part of an investigation." Laura's eyebrows furrowed. She had never heard of such a thing. An investigation. "But I don't understand. What exactly are you looking for?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The officer hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm afraid I can't provide the details, but we need to search, ma'am. Please step aside." Laura stood her ground. "I'm sorry, officer, but I can't let you in without a proper warrant," she said firmly. It was her right to protect her privacy, and she wasn't going to let her house be searched without understanding why. She wasn't scared, but the situation was starting to feel uncomfortable. These were her personal spaces, her home, and she needed to know why the police were here. The officers exchanged quick glances. They were clearly not used to being questioned like this, but the officer who had spoken to her first insisted, "Ma'am, this is a legal matter. We can't explain everything right now, but we have our orders." The tension in the air was palpable. Laura could feel her heart racing in her chest, but she tried to stay calm. "I understand," she said, "but I'll need to speak with my husband first. You're welcome to wait, but I'm not letting you in without his approval." The officer seemed to pause for a moment, perhaps weighing his options. He looked back at his team, his face showing signs of frustration. But Laura wasn't backing down. She knew her rights, and she wasn't about to let a group of police officers enter her home without a clear reason. The officers stepped back, muttering among themselves. Laura quickly closed the door, her mind racing. She reached for her phone, thinking about calling her husband, but she hesitated. What was going on? Why were they at her house? And why were they so insistent on entering? As she paced back and forth, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The idea of police officers searching her home, without any explanation, made her feel vulnerable. Her husband was the commissioner, a man of great authority. But now she was left to deal with this situation on her own. She didn't know what to expect next, but she was sure of one thing. Things were about to get a lot more complicated. Laura couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Her heart was still racing, and the strange feeling of uncertainty weighed heavily on her. She stood near the door for a moment, her mind filled with questions. Why had the officers shown up at her house? And why were they insisting on searching without a clear reason? After a few seconds, she grabbed her phone, but she stopped herself before calling her husband. It was still early, and he was probably busy at the office. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The officers hadn't explained themselves, and now they were waiting outside her door as if they were entitled to enter. She decided to call a close friend, someone who might help her make sense of what was happening. As she dialed the number, she glanced out the window, seeing the officers standing in front of the house, their expressions cold and unreadable. The sight of them made her feel even more uneasy. Her friend answered quickly. "Hello, Laura. Is everything okay?" "I don't know," Laura replied, her voice trembling slightly. "There are police officers outside my house, and they're demanding to search. They haven't given me a reason, and they don't have a warrant. Her friend's voice was filled with concern. "What? That doesn't sound right. You have the right to refuse them unless they have a legal reason. Have you called your husband yet?" Laura nodded, though her friend couldn't see it. "I was about to, but I didn't want to worry him if it's nothing." "You're not bothering him, Laura. He's the commissioner. If anyone can stop this, it's him." That's when it hit Laura. Her husband was the commissioner, and he had the power to put an end to this. She felt a little better knowing he could help, but the situation still made her uneasy. The officers weren't backing down, and it seemed like they were growing more impatient by the second. Laura sighed and said goodbye to her friend, feeling a bit more determined. It was time to call her husband. She quickly dialed his number and waited as it rang. "Hello," came his voice on the other end. "Laura, what's wrong?" She tried to sound calm. "There are police officers at the house, and they're trying to search without a warrant. They haven't told me why, but they keep insisting." There was a pause on the other end, and then her husband spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Stay where you are. I'm coming home right now. I'll handle this." Laura felt a wave of relief wash over her. Her husband's voice was always reassuring, and she knew he would take care of everything. But as she hung up the phone, the reality of the situation started to sink in again. These officers had no right to be here, and they were trying to take advantage of her alone at home. It wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It felt like an invasion. She glanced back out the window and saw the officers still standing there, waiting for her response. They looked as if they expected her to cave in, but Laura wasn't about to let them pressure her. Her husband would be here soon, and he would make sure they knew they couldn't just walk all over her. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever as she waited. Every second felt like an eternity, and with each tick of the clock, she grew more certain that these officers weren't just doing their job. They were pushing boundaries, perhaps without even realizing it. Laura didn't know what was going to happen next, but one thing was clear. The moment her husband arrived, things were going to change. As Laura stood by the door, her mind raced. She knew she had every right to refuse the officers, but it wasn't easy. The tension in the air was thick. She could feel the pressure building, the officers outside growing more impatient with each passing minute. Every time she glanced out the window, she saw them standing there, their faces set, as if waiting for her to cave in. She knew they were expecting her to let them in. After all, who would question the police, especially when they were standing outside, acting like they had the authority to search her home? But Laura wasn't just anyone. She was the commissioner's wife, and she wasn't going to let them invade her privacy without a good reason. Her fingers gripped the door handle as she debated what to do next. She knew she couldn't let them inside without proper documentation or a warrant. It wasn't just about following the law. It was about standing her ground. If she let them in now, where would it stop? What if they came back again? What if they tried to push even further? Laura's heart beat faster, but she steadied herself. She had to stay calm. She took a deep breath and walked back to the window. The officers were still there, talking amongst themselves. They didn't seem to realize that they had underestimated her. They thought that because she was alone, she would be easy to intimidate, but she wasn't going to let that happen. She turned around and walked back to the door. With a steady hand, she opened it just a crack, enough to speak through. "I'm sorry, but I cannot allow you to search my home without a proper warrant," she said, trying to keep her voice firm but polite. One of the officers stepped forward. "Ma'am, you need to understand that this is serious. We have orders, and we need to do our job." Laura shook her head. "I understand that, officer, but I'm not going to let you in without the proper legal papers. I've been more than patient, but this isn't right." The officer's face darkened. "Ma'am, you're making this harder than it needs to be." Laura could feel the pressure mounting, but she didn't let it sway her. She stood tall, refusing to back down. She knew her husband, the commissioner, would back her up once he arrived. But she also knew that right now it was up to her. She couldn't let herself be intimidated into giving in. Not now. She glanced at the clock on the wall. She could feel her husband getting closer. He would be home soon, and when he arrived, things would change. The officers would realize they couldn't just walk all over her. But until then, she wasn't going to make things easy for them. She closed the door halfway and spoke again, her voice strong. "I'll wait for my husband to return. He will handle this. Until then, I'm afraid you'll have to wait outside." The officers looked at each other, clearly unsure how to respond. They hadn't expected this kind of resistance. Laura could see their frustration building, but she didn't care. She had made her decision, and she was sticking to it. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the officers stepped back, clearly not willing to argue further. They stood there, watching her, their posture stiff and uneasy. Laura didn't know what they were thinking, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let them bully her into doing something she didn't want to do. She closed the door, her heart still pounding, but with a sense of relief. She had stood up for herself. Now, all she could do was wait for her husband to arrive and make sure this situation was put to rest once and for all. The minutes seemed to drag on forever. Laura paced nervously in the hallway, her mind racing. She had called her husband, and he had promised to come home right away, but she wasn't sure how long it would take for him to arrive. Each passing second felt like an eternity. Her heart still pounded in her chest, but she refused to let fear take over. She walked back to the window and looked outside again. The officers were still standing there, their faces a mixture of impatience and frustration. They had been there for what seemed like hours, and Laura could feel the pressure mounting. She knew they wouldn't just leave. They had made up their minds, and they were determined to get what they wanted. Despite her growing anxiety, she reminded herself that she wasn't alone in this. Her husband would be there soon, and he would take charge. He had the authority to handle the situation, to put an end to this whole ordeal. But until then, Laura had to stay strong. As she stood by the window, she overheard the officers talking to one another. Their voices were low but filled with tension. One of them seemed frustrated, while another tried to reassure the group that they needed to stay calm and wait. Laura couldn't help but listen, trying to get a sense of their next move. "It's not right," one officer muttered. "She's not cooperating. We're just trying to do our job, and she's making it difficult." "Maybe she's scared," another officer replied. "But we can't back down now. We've got orders to follow." The words stunned Laura. It wasn't about fear. It was about principle. She wasn't going to let them walk all over her just because they were in a position of power. She understood the importance of law and order, but she also knew that her rights mattered. She wasn't just some helpless woman. She had the right to stand up for herself and her home. The conversation outside seemed to grow more heated, and Laura's patience began to wear thin. She knew they were trying to wear her down, to make her feel like she was being unreasonable. But she refused to give in. She wasn't going to allow them to search her house without a proper reason. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the door. Laura froze, her heart racing. She quickly glanced out the window again. But this time, she saw a car pulling up in the driveway. It was her husband's car. Relief flooded through her as she realized he had arrived. The officers outside didn't seem to notice the car at first. But as her husband stepped out of the vehicle, the atmosphere shifted. Laura watched from the window as the officers turned their attention to him. The sight of the commissioner arriving was enough to change everything. Her husband walked confidently toward the door, his steps purposeful. She opened the door for him, her hands shaking with a mixture of nerves and relief. As soon as he entered the house, he looked at the officers outside, his expression calm but serious. Laura could see that he wasn't happy with what had been happening, but she also knew that he would handle it the way only he could. "Officers," he called out, his voice carrying authority. "What is going on here?" The officers shifted uneasily. They had been hoping to get their way, but now that the commissioner was home, it was clear things were about to change. Laura could already see the shift in their behavior, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Her husband was here. and the power dynamic was about to change. The moment her husband stepped out of the car, Laura felt a wave of relief wash over her. His arrival was the turning point. All the tension, the anxiety, and the pressure she had felt just moments before seemed to melt away. She opened the door to greet him, her heart racing, but now with a sense of calm. Her husband, Commissioner James Miller, was a man known for his calm and steady demeanor. As he stepped inside the house, his presence immediately filled the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with authority. Laura knew that once he was here, things would change. The officers outside, who had been so sure of themselves moments ago, now seemed a little less certain. "James," Laura said softly, her voice a mix of relief and exhaustion. "They've been here for so long, demanding to search, but they won't tell me why. I've refused them, but they're not backing down." Her husband nodded, his expression serious but reassuring. "Don't worry, Laura. I'll handle this." He turned toward the window and glanced at the officers standing outside, who had begun to shift uncomfortably now that he was on the scene. Without wasting another second, James stepped outside, his face calm and confident. Laura watched from the doorway, still feeling the weight of the situation but knowing that her husband would know exactly how to handle it. The officers who had been so eager to continue their search suddenly stood straighter when they saw James approach. There was no more casual talking among them, no more hurried whispers. They knew who he was, and they knew that they weren't dealing with just any ordinary citizen now. James walked up to the group of officers, his voice steady and clear. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes scanning the group. The officer who had been in charge of the situation looked nervous but tried to stay professional. "Commissioner, we've been instructed to search your wife's home as part of an investigation. We don't have all the details, but we were given orders." James raised an eyebrow, his expression hardening. "And you thought it was appropriate to come to my house and search without a proper warrant?" The officer hesitated, his discomfort evident. We were just following orders, sir." "Following orders," James repeated, his voice now sharp. "You're not a soldier on a battlefield. You're officers of the law. You're supposed to act with responsibility, and that includes respecting people's rights. You had no right to be here." The tension between them was thick. The officers stood there, clearly unsure of how to respond. They hadn't expected this. They had assumed that with Laura alone, they could push their way in and continue with their search. But now, with the commissioner himself standing in front of them, it was clear that they had crossed a line. James didn't raise his voice, but his calm authority made it clear that this wasn't going to be a discussion. "I want you to leave my property. Now." The officers looked at each other, their faces filled with a mix of confusion and hesitation. They had thought they were in control, but now they'd realized they had made a mistake. Slowly, they began to step back, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. It was as if they had expected James to back down or to question his own authority. But instead, they found themselves caught in their own error. Laura, watching from the doorway, felt a wave of gratitude and admiration for her husband. She knew he had the power to put a stop to this, but seeing him stand up so confidently gave her a sense of security she hadn't felt in hours. As the officers finally turned and walked away, James turned back to her, his expression softening. "You okay?" he asked gently. Laura smiled, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. "I am now. Thank you." The officers, defeated and silent, walked away from the house without saying another word. As they left, Laura watched them in disbelief, still trying to understand what had just happened. They had been so sure of themselves when they first arrived, acting as though they had the right to search her home without any valid reason. But now, they were leaving without a word of apology or explanation. Her husband, James, stood beside her, his eyes following the officers as they walked down the driveway and out of the gate. Laura felt a sense of relief wash over her. The storm had passed, and the tension that had been thick in the air for hours was now gone. James turned to her with a reassuring smile. "It's over, Laura. They won't be back." She nodded, though a small part of her still couldn't quite believe it. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come home when you did." James reached out and took her hand, his expression softening. "You did the right thing, refusing to let them in. But this could have gotten worse if I wasn't here to put a stop to it." They were out of line. Laura couldn't agree more. She had felt so alone and vulnerable earlier, but now, with her husband standing by her side, everything felt safe again. "Do you think they'll be punished?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity and concern. James looked thoughtful for a moment before answering. "I don't know yet, but I'll make sure this is investigated. No one, no officer, is above the law. They need to be held accountable for what they did." Laura felt a sense of reassurance at his words. James was not just a man of authority. He was a man of integrity. She knew he wouldn't let this go, and that gave her peace of mind. As the minutes passed, the quiet of their home began to settle in again. The ordeal had shaken Laura, but it had also shown her the strength of her husband. She could see now that the incident wasn't just about a search gone wrong. It was about standing up for what was right. James walked over to the door and looked outside one last time, making sure the officers were truly gone. He turned back to her and said, "Let's not waste any more time worrying about them. I'm here now, and nothing's going to happen to you." Laura smiled, feeling more at ease now. "I know. Thank you, James." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation finally beginning to lift. Laura was exhausted, but she couldn't help but feel proud. Her husband's presence had changed everything. She wasn't just the commissioner's wife. She was someone who had stood her ground, who had fought for her rights, and who had come out stronger because of it. James gently pulled her into an embrace, his arms wrapping around her in a comforting gesture. "We'll get through this, Laura," he said softly. "You're not alone. I won't let anyone treat you like that again." The sound of his voice, full of warmth and confidence, made Laura feel safe in a way she hadn't in hours. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but with James by her side, she was ready for anything. As the day finally started to wind down, the couple found comfort in the quiet moments they shared. The ordeal had tested them both, but it had also brought them closer together. Laura felt a renewed sense of respect for her husband, not just as the commissioner, but as the man who had stood up for her, no questions asked. And with that thought, the weight of the day slowly melted away, leaving only a sense of relief and gratitude. The house was quiet again, but the calm didn't last for long. After the officers had left, Laura and James decided to sit down and talk about what had just happened. Laura was still feeling the weight of the day, the tension and fear she had felt earlier lingering in her mind. She knew she would need time to fully shake off the unease, but for now, she just needed to talk. James had already made a few calls, contacting his colleagues to discuss what had occurred and to make sure there would be no further issues. As he sat across from her, he sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. "I don't like what happened today, Laura. This shouldn't have gone down like this. It's an abuse of power, and I'm going to make sure it's addressed." Laura nodded, but her mind was still racing. "Do you think they'll face consequences?" "I'll make sure of it," James said firmly. "This isn't the kind of thing that should be ignored. They've crossed a line, and they need to be held accountable. I'll handle it from here." Before Laura could respond, there was a knock at the door. James stood up quickly, his expression hardening, ready for whatever was about to come. Was it another officer? Had they come back to argue? Or worse, try to intimidate them again? James walked to the door and opened it. To his surprise, it wasn't another officer. It was the same group of officers who had tried to search their house earlier. They stood there, looking a little uncomfortable, as if they weren't sure how to proceed. "Commissioner," the lead officer said, his tone much more respectful this time. We need to apologize for what happened earlier. It was wrong, and we didn't handle the situation the way we should have." Laura stood up from the table, surprised by the officer's words. She had expected more resistance, not an apology. But as she looked at the officers, she could see the guilt in their eyes. They had realized their mistake. The officer continued, "We were just following orders, but that doesn't excuse the way we treated you or your wife." "Sir." James nodded slowly, not sure what to say at first. He had expected the officers to make excuses or try to justify their actions, but this was different. "I appreciate you coming back to apologize," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It takes courage to admit when you've made a mistake." The officer seemed to relax slightly, but he didn't stop there. "We understand if you need to file a formal complaint or take further action. We just want to make sure you know that this won't happen again." We were out of line." James took a deep breath, his thoughts racing. He knew this apology wouldn't erase the damage that had been done, but it was a step in the right direction. He was a man of fairness, and he believed in giving people the chance to correct their mistakes. "Thank you for coming back," James said. "I'll take your apology into consideration. But understand this. This kind of behavior won't be tolerated again, not by anyone. Not in my department." The officers nodded, clearly relieved that things weren't escalating further. "We understand, sir. We're truly sorry for the trouble we caused." As they left, Laura couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. She had been shaken by the events earlier, but now, seeing the officers take responsibility for their actions, she felt a sense of closure. The tension that had been building throughout the day was finally starting to fade. James turned to her and smiled. "Well, I think that's the last of it. They've learned their lesson, and we can move on." Laura smiled back, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. "Thank you, James. You handled everything perfectly." James reached out and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "It's what I'm here for, Laura, to protect you, and to make sure things are done right." And with that, they both knew that this chapter was closed. The officers had apologized, the situation was under control, and they could finally put the events behind them. But more than that, they both knew that they had learned something important about standing up for what was right, and about the strength they shared together. As the day turned into evening, the tension that had been building for hours finally seemed to lift. Laura and James sat together in the living room, a sense of quiet settling over the house. The ordeal was over, but the memory of what had happened still lingered in the air. Laura couldn't help but reflect on everything that had unfolded. How the police had arrived without explanation, how she had stood her ground, and how her husband had come to her defense when she needed him the most. But even with everything that had happened, she knew it wasn't truly over yet. James had already made it clear that there would be consequences for the officer's actions. He wouldn't let this slide, and Laura admired him for that. It was one thing for the officers to apologize, but another to make sure they understood the seriousness of what they had done. The next morning, James didn't waste any time. As soon as he arrived at the office, he began gathering the necessary information to launch an internal investigation. He spoke with his colleagues, explaining everything that had happened and ensuring that the officers involved would be held accountable for their actions. Laura had hoped for an apology, but now that it was clear that her husband wasn't going to let this go, she felt a weight lifted off her shoulders. James had always been someone who believed in fairness and justice. She knew he wouldn't stop until everything was sorted out. For the next few days, James worked tirelessly to review the situation and gather all the facts. He reached out to the officers who had been involved, requesting their statements and looking into the orders they had received. The more he dug, the clearer it became that the officers had not followed proper protocol, and they had acted without sufficient cause. Despite their apology, it was clear that the officers' actions had been far from justified. James knew that they had to face the consequences of their poor decision-making. It wasn't just about what had happened to Laura. It was about ensuring that such mistakes didn't happen again, to her or anyone else. After completing his investigation, James called for a meeting with the officers involved. He had already spoken with their superiors and made it clear that their behavior had been unacceptable. He didn't want to be harsh, but he wanted to ensure that they understood the seriousness of the situation. When the officers arrived for the meeting, they looked nervous, as if they knew what was coming. James stood in front of them, his face serious but not angry. "I've reviewed the situation," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What you did was wrong. You acted without proper cause and without following protocol. Your actions caused unnecessary distress to my wife, and I cannot let that go unnoticed." The officers listened quietly, their heads down in shame. James didn't shout or raise his voice. Instead, he explained what had gone wrong and made it clear that their behavior wasn't acceptable under any circumstances. "The punishment for your actions is a suspension. You'll be off duty while we review your conduct, and you'll be required to undergo additional training on how to handle situations like this in the future. This is not just about rules. It's about respecting the people you serve." The officers nodded, fully aware that there was no way to avoid the consequences. They had made a mistake, and now they had to face the repercussions. Once the meeting was over, James returned home to Laura. He didn't need to say much. She could tell from his expression that everything had been taken care of. "They'll be off duty for a while," he said simply. "They've got a lot to think about." Laura smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't just about the punishment. It was about knowing that justice had been done. "Thank you for handling everything, James. You did what was right." James reached out and took her hand. "We did it together. And I'll always be here to make sure you are safe." The incident had been a difficult and unexpected challenge, but in the end, it had shown Laura the strength of her husband's commitment to fairness. As for the officers, they had learned a valuable lesson. Actions have consequences, and no one is above the law. The days after the incident felt quieter, more peaceful. The house, which had been filled with tension just a few days earlier, now felt like home again. Laura and James spent their time getting back to their normal routine, but the events that had unfolded still lingered in their minds. Laura often found herself thinking back to that moment when the officers first arrived at her door. She had been so frightened, not knowing what was going to happen next. But she had stood her ground. She had refused to let them enter her home without a good reason. And in doing so, she had learned something important about her own strength. She wasn't helpless, and she wasn't going to let anyone walk all over her. James, too, reflected on the situation. He had always been someone who took his job seriously, but this experience had reminded him of why he worked so hard to protect the people he cared about. He had been ready to stand up for Laura, no matter what. But as he looked back, he realized that it wasn't just about the police officers and their mistake. It was about the bigger picture. He was there to protect everyone, and he would continue to fight for justice, no matter the cost. One afternoon, as they sat in the living room, Laura turned to her husband. "James, I've been thinking," she said softly. "I know it wasn't easy, but I think we both learned something from this. I realized that I'm stronger than I thought. I didn't just wait for you to solve it. I stood up for myself." James smiled warmly, feeling proud of her. "You were incredible, Laura. I'm proud of you, too. But it's also important to remember that no one should have to go through that kind of thing alone. You had every right to feel the way you did, and I'm glad we handled it together." Laura nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had never doubted her husband's support, but now, after everything that had happened, she felt even more certain of it. They were a team, and together, they could face anything. Later that evening, as they sat down for dinner, James received a call from one of his colleagues. He spoke for a few moments, his face serious, but when he hung up, he turned to Laura with a smile. "The officers who were involved have been suspended for their actions. They'll also have to undergo retraining. Everything's been handled." Laura's heart lightened with relief. The officers had learned their lesson, and the situation had been resolved fairly. She didn't need to worry anymore. "Thank you for making sure it was dealt with properly, James. It's nice to know that justice was done." James nodded, his face thoughtful. It wasn't just about punishing them. It was about making sure something like this doesn't happen again. Everyone deserves respect, and we can't let power be abused. As the evening went on, they shared a quiet dinner, reflecting on everything that had happened. Though the situation had been difficult, it had brought them closer together. Laura now understood that even in the most challenging moments, there was always room for growth. She had faced her fears, stood up for herself, and seen her husband's commitment to fairness and justice. The situation had tested them both, but in the end, they had come out stronger. It was a reminder that no matter what life threw their way, they would always stand by each other's side, fighting for what was right. And that, more than anything, gave Laura a sense of peace she hadn't had before. As the night fell, Laura and James sat together, content in the knowledge that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they were ready to face them together.